Yeah, it's a well, this is big stuff. And I'm talking to somebody in a circle over there. Here's sitting in on the drums. So there's a car. Yeah, it's pretty nice.
Jim, we're recording.
And I'm glad not.
Yeah, but 12 days.
Boy.
Yeah, I'm talking to somebody. I look over and shoot. That's to have that. So this guy knows how it is.
Thanks, James.
That's pretty cool.
We have
Oh.
she was entertained. And help someone comes in handy. I'll bring our expertise. Lisa, you ready to go?
Yes.
Okay,
For sure.
all right, good. Jane's got us up and operating. Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. It is Wednesday, August 4th, 2021. And about 5:31 p.m. and we're going to call to order the meeting of the Edina City Council for its work session for this particular day. Roll call, please, Ms. Tim.
Member Anderson.
Here.
Member Jackson.
Here.
Member Pierce.
Here.
Member Staunton.
Here.
Mayor Hubble.
Here. We have on the work session agenda this evening a couple of matters, one of which will put us in the closed session. But first, we're going to have Lisa Schaefer introduce this first topic, which is a staffing study that was done with respect to public works and park maintenance. And so, Assistant City Manager Lisa Schaefer, go ahead.
Thank you. We started the Public Works, Park Maintenance, and Facility Staffing Study in February. Very similar to what we've done previously in our public safety areas. In this case, we were looking at our next area, which was primarily focused on public works. And like I said, also park maintenance. The consultants spent a lot of time with employees reviewing our data and really trying to look at what might our needs and staffing levels look like to meet the needs in the future. And so at this point, Jonathan is here to deliver the consultants' recommendations. So we received these recommendations last week. We are still thoroughly reviewing them as staff. The next step will be for us as a leadership team on the staff side to really dive into the recommendations in more detail and come up with our proposed plan for a long-term operational plan and what changes we might need in the future. So I will turn it over to Jonathan.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Lisa. And thank you very much for, it's very good to be physically present with you this evening. You know, as a person who travels for a living, I never thought I would say how pleased I am to be on the road again. So it's very good to be with you. Just make sure this works here. So just to quickly kind of touch base on what we want to try to accomplish today. So just want to tell you a little bit about who we are as a firm, just to orient you with who's in the room. Obviously, my name is Jonathan Ingram. I'm with Raftellus Financial Consultants, and we and the Novak Consulting Group. We merged about 2 years ago at this point. Novak Consulting Group and Raftellus. And I'll tell you a little bit about who we are. Walk through the project design and sort of what our task was, what are the questions that we were asked to explore, and then talk about our methodology. So you have some understanding of what's our process, you know, who do we engage with, what kind of work did we engage in, and tasks did we engage in to come up with a series of recommendations. And then we'll want to review those key findings with you. We're not going to review all 23 recommendations with you in detail. We know you have a busy schedule, but we'll hit the high points and give you a good sense of what our findings were in major areas, those areas that have recommendations that have financial implications we want to share with you, of course. And of course, the project report will be made available to you after this session as well. And of course, question and answer. Anytime you have a question that we're moving through, just feel free to stop. No need to wait till the end. Just engage in the conversation. So Raftellus, just quickly who we are. We are a local government consulting firm, and we work exclusively with city and county governments and utilities. So we have a few different practice areas. We're really the largest local government center consulting firm in the United States. We do a lot of rate studies, water, wastewater, stormwater rate studies in our firm. My particular area of focus is on the management consulting side. And on management consulting, we have really three primary focus areas. The first is strategic planning. So we help organizations determine where they're at and where they want to be. Executive recruitment, we help hire, especially high level positions. So we manage that process. And I'm in the organizational assessment side of the house, right? So that includes staffing and deployment studies, process improvement projects, financial plans, those kinds of things. So those things that tie in some way directly to the operations and management of a local government. And that's really the bucket that this particular project fell under. So what were we asked to do? So there's a kind of a few kind of key buckets that I want to talk about. So the first is really what we were asked was looking at the public works and operations function in the organization. So just to give you a little context of how this project started, it was actually originally conceived and contracted before COVID, right? So we kind of got reared up to go, and then COVID happened, and like everyone else, we all just kind of slowed down and made sure that we could kind of weather the storm, so to speak. From the point that the contract was initiated to now, there were some reorganizations. So there were some facilities was moved under engineering. So we looked at parks, and then park maintenance was added. So we wanted to look at the park maintenance operations as well. So we made a couple of revisions from originally conceived. But the focus again on those operations pieces, facilities, public works, the entire operation, and also the park maintenance functions. So our specific task in each of these areas was really service level focused, and this is really the way that we approach staffing studies, really in any area. The question is, what is the service level that you expect in your community, and what are the resources that you have to commit in order to meet that service level? And if you are short of those resource commitments, right, it sort of leads you to the conversation: do we have the right service level? And if not, if we want to maintain that service level, what resources do we need to add to kind of make sure we get there? So we looked at your service level. We spent a lot of time, and I'll talk a little bit about kind of how we engage in the process, really identifying what your service levels and what the community expects, and what really your managers and you all, would expect as part of the operation. We then compared that to best practices that exist. So could be national organizations like the International Facility Management Association, the American Water Works Association, APWA. These organizations that really provide a good framework and good benchmarking for what do other organizations do well, and why does it work. So we did some comparison there, as well as some benchmarking comparison with a few of your peers relevant to some specific recommendations. And then we really started to identify, okay, what do you need from a resource perspective to meet those best practices, to meet service levels? And are there places, so not just adding staff, but are there places in the organization where we can improve processes, or there's obvious opportunities to address, to create capacity through improvements without necessarily adding staff? So we looked at it really from both lenses. The primary focus is obviously what staff do we need to get the job done, right? And then, of course, defining those clear service level goals and setting up a frameworks for how you all can measure off into the future. What are the things you want to pay attention to determine whether or not you need additional personnel in the future as the environment changes, as service level expectations adjust as well. So we applied a pretty extensive approach. We spent time really meeting with each of the managers in each of those functional areas, as well as about 57 staff at each level of the organization. So those were one-on-one interviews, focus groups, small group conversations. We also completed a number of tours, really just to get a good understanding of what's the operating environment, and how do different folks in different levels of the organization experience working for the city. Where do they see bottlenecks? Where do they see constraints in the delivery of work? And then we spend a lot of time diving into data. So workload data, work order information, what's really driving daily service requirements in each one of these functional areas. We then went through a process of, again, doing that best practice comparison and completing our own initial our own comprehensive analysis to identify what those sort of improvement areas or potential or areas to add personnel or adjust personnel. There are some adjustments as well. Spent some time kind of sharing those initial findings. So it's an iterative process with us. So we will carry this forward with city staff and make sure we're interpreting things correctly, right? So we kind of went through a process to ultimately develop these recommendations and the project report will share. So what are the key findings and recommendations? Just kind of jumping into meat and potatoes. I know you all have an executive session coming, right? So I'll spend just a little bit of time kind of hitting on some of the key points here. Again, there are 23 total recommendations that we've made relevant to staffing and some process specific items. Just a couple of general observations before we begin. So one of the things that I think just is important to note, a very high level of commitment to your service levels in this community from staff. So a very high level of commitment, a great deal of pride in work. And really over the past several years, especially with things like the Mill Overlay Program, right? A lot of silos, I think, have broken down. There have been a lot of improvements in terms of how different crews are working together. So we saw a lot of positive things. I think there's an incredible foundation in this community, just in terms of staff and resources that are available. good equipment, right? Good resources available, it really pairs with those high service level expectations. But there are, of course, some staffing challenges. So there's a few areas that I just want to highlight before we jump into the details. So there's some service level and best practice gaps, especially on the stormwater management side, sidewalk maintenance side. There's some process improvement opportunities, I think, in terms of just shifting the approach to work to really maximize some resources in asphalt paving. Really great program. The mill and overlay program is outstanding. The degree to which it's increased your pavement condition just over the past few years, honestly, has been dramatic. So there's really an opportunity to kind of continue that great resource, which is not a very common resource to have in-house. And really continue to capitalize on that as a great opportunity for the city. There's some challenges on the park maintenance side. You all love your ice rinks, right? You love hockey in Edina, the center of the hockey universe, which is great. And your snowplow process is second to none, really, in the country, right? So we want to protect those really important service levels. But look at, okay, how can we potentially adjust the process with which and how we manage that to sort of make sure that staff have adequate time off during those peak periods, right? To make sure that service level occurs as expected, but to generate some efficiencies in some of those processes as well. So I'll run through just each one of the departments at a high level and start with the public works side of the house. So we'll begin on stormwater management. So there's a couple of a few areas really on the stormwater side. So the city, like most cities who have a separate sanitary sewer, you have an MS4 permit, which essentially defines what your pollutant discharges and the specific best management practices that you all have to engage to protect your watersheds and to protect stormwater quality and water quality in the area, right? The MS4 permit has identified really a number of opportunities to implement some BMPs. One of the big areas is in street sweeping. Now, right now, street sweeping occurs on a limited basis in Edina. It occurs in the spring, a couple times a year, sometimes additionally, as particular issues arise. The best practice is really to move forward about 10 times a year. We really see an opportunity to add some personnel on the street sweeping side to create some extra capacity to start to move toward that area. It's very likely that you may need additional personnel on the street sweeping side and the stormwater management side in that space alone. But adding a couple folks, an additional street sweeper as a backup, will really provide some additional capacity to be much more proactive, and it will have a fundamentally positive impact on those MS4 and those stormwater management outcomes. We also look at your catch basins, right? So those the traps essentially that collect and mitigate the amount of waste, road waste, essentially, that moves into the water stream. Right now, there's a pretty good process in place where the city uses interns to inspect about 25% of those catch basins annually, and that's great. Really, the best practice is to try to get them done to inspect 100% of them annually. So, adding some capacity in that area to really, increase the opportunity to more assertively inspect those catch basins, especially on the public works side. The benefit of having some folks on public works who aren't necessarily interns is you can double not only the inspection, but also the maintenance and the cleaning of those catch basins as well. So adding additional personnel to do that work isn't necessarily guaranteed to get you to kind of a once a year rotation, but it's going to fundamentally improve that service level and give you a good baseline to start to evaluate what additional needs might there be in that space as well. We also look at storm sewer inspections. So, right now there's about 127,000, 147 miles of storm sewer in the city. So that's a lot, right? The city right now utilizes a personnel on the wastewater side to inspect the sanitary sewer on an annual basis, right? That's the piece that if there's a problem, you're going to hear, you all very specifically, you're going to hear it very directly and very loudly from your residents, right? So there's some history with this kind of a program. Building a similar program on the storm sewer side to really televise and inspect and understand that condition and incorporate that into your capital planning process and your preventive maintenance process. We'll just have an opportunity again to really add some value on that MS4 permit side. We looked at a couple options here. There's an opportunity to contract for this televising program or potentially add personnel. We have some good benchmark information. Actually, the city of Minneapolis just did a large contract to televise their entire infrastructure. So we have some decent, relevant, recent costs in terms of what it might be and what cost per linear foot. But some comparison there. There may be some real value in adding actually staff to do this in-house versus contract, or maybe some combination of the two to really generate some capacity there as well. So some kind of cost benefit will be required. It'll really depend on what cost you get from the contracting and the bid process. But some opportunity to really increase capacity in that space as well. On the water system maintenance side, this is really an area where we see a couple of opportunities to implement some best practices. So right now, the city implements basically goes through a process of flushing water mains, but does not have a proactive valve exercising program. So there are a couple of really best practices. One of them is unidirectional flushing water mains, and this gets a bit technical, but essentially what it does is kind of creates an opportunity and a process where you are consistently flushing mains. And what it does is it takes the particulates, it cleans the mains, it reduces turbidity, increases water quality, it decreases mineral buildup, right? And the process of doing that actually requires you to exercise out the valves as part of the process. So really, there's some best practices that can be done here, and it's actually a bit more, it's a little less time intensive than traditional flushing as well. So there's some opportunity to implement this program. I will say initially, you're going to have some increases in valve breaks, right? So you'll have some spikes in expenses, especially, and some spikes in terms of work orders and the impact on staff, because without that valve exercising program, you're going to have a number of valves that are going to need a significant sort of upgrade. So you can expect to see that as part of the process. Don't be alarmed, but ultimately, kind of getting over that hump is really going to have a pretty fundamental impact on the condition of the infrastructure. The street and sidewalk maintenance side is also another area that we spent a lot of time in, and I'll spend just a couple seconds talking about again that asphalt paving approach. So when we look at asphalt maintenance, so again, I'll reiterate the mill and overlay program that you all have implemented. You're paving between 5 and 7 miles. Eventually, you're going to kind of run out of street in terms of the mill and overlay program, right? It's a great goal. It's a good program. There's an opportunity to potentially start to use that staff in conjunction with some of your more significant road reconstruction projects to capitalize on that internal resource and potentially, be able to leverage that resource further. So just again, capitalizing on that program, using that staff with that great skill set and equipment that you have. This is one of those areas, though, that's going to really need to be filtered through your public works director and your engineer. It's going to be a case-by-case basis, depending on what else is going on. There's also some additional sidewalk maintenance work, which we'll talk about, which will have some impact on public works personnel as well. But just an opportunity to pay attention to and start to build on. So on the street and sidewalk maintenance program, this is really an area where you all a very walkable community, right? I mean, great sidewalks, great neighborhoods. I've had the pleasure of spending more time here than just enough for a meeting, right? It's a great community, and you all have really expanded your sidewalk infrastructure as well over the past several years, with some significant plans to expand that even further in the future. Right now, in the city of Edina, ultimately, it's the responsibility of the property owner, right, to correct sidewalk issues that are out of code, right? And you all are at I believe, if I recall correctly, it's a 1/2-inch gap or tripping hazard. So pretty standard sidewalk maintenance kinds of issues. There are a number of communities who are much more proactive about inspecting those sidewalks and proactively addressing safety issues, either as the city government or through contract, and ultimately passing those expenses on and coordinating with the property owner to be able to manage that. So there's some opportunity to implement that program. That'll need some additional personnel just from the inspection perspective. If you all ultimately start to develop this program out and determine, well, why don't we take on the responsibility of building, of making significant concrete repairs, that's likely going to require additional personnel as well. So, but there's an opportunity to build a program here, but you need that inspection capacity to really drive it, manage the program, manage the citizen engagement and interaction, that kind of thing. We also looked at the fleet shop. So we completed an analysis with your fleet group. Again, it's a little bit of kind of inside baseball, but we essentially look at, the number of vehicles that you have, the types of vehicles that you have, and the impact that it has on the number of preventive maintenance hours and reactive maintenance hours that you need in a given year, right? So a dump truck, that you're using for your snowplow routes requires a lot more attention than a normal passenger car, right? So we went through a process of sussing that out, determining what your real load is, and really came up that you're about staffed correctly on the fleet side. You have the right number of mechanics based on the infrastructure that you have, but you do also have your mechanics who are being drawn away for tasks that they probably ought not to be engaging in. So they're not fleet maintenance. They're helping facility maintenance things. They obviously have a snowplow route commitment. Really, just about everybody in public works and a few other departments have a role in that process, and that remains. But creating some additional capacity on that side. We also see some opportunity to improve generator maintenance. There's some best practices there that we've identified, and really the issue, I don't want to get too much into weeds, but load bank testing and really testing the circuitry of those items or those generators, as well as recycling that needs to field before they're stale. So there's some maintenance that needs there. And then training for mechanics. We also see some need, and this is on the facility side as well, for a more up-to-date fleet management system. Okay, and that's really going to help with the process of managing workload as well, and maximizing the efficacy of that group. So the big one, right? Snow and ice cream. This is obviously a service level that needs to be protected, really, no matter what, right? That's our marching orders. And honestly, even if we didn't get those marching orders, we've been in enough communities to know don't mess with them. Don't mess with them. That's no problem. The reality is, your city, your public works department, to some degree, is designed to make sure that you can meet that service level on the snowplow side, right? So if you start to lose staff in other areas, it has an impact on your ability to really achieve to meet those route demands. Some facility staff, park staff are also utilized for the snowplow route process. Now, we did see a few areas in the design of the routes. You have peer communities. We looked at a number of peer communities. How many routes do you have? How many folks are you dedicated to that? What are you going to spend on your snowplow routes process? And you have fewer lane miles per route compared to really the peers that we looked at. That's not a big deal, right? That's sort of to be expected. But one of the things that's an opportunity for further exploration is just an opportunity to potentially. There may be opportunities to reduce the number of routes that you have while still maintaining your service levels. There are some some process issues with respect to the snowplow. There's some really good ideas from your frontline staff in terms of call outs and the procedure for a full crew gets called out versus partial crew, and creating some consistency. But that's a process that needs some further exploration, some GIS work, right? Some things that are kind of outside of the scope. So we've included a recommendation to look at that. Now, what I will say is you may go through that process and determine you still need the same routes. They may be configured a little bit differently. They may be more efficient. It may generate capacity for your staff to take leave during winter months, right? That's a major concern, especially for frontline folks. I can't take any vacation or time off in the winter, right? You have to put it in October, and you're lucky if you get it, right? So that's the name of the game. But to the degree you can generate some flexibility, that's an important value. So just an opportunity in that space. Now on the facility side. So you all went through a process in 2019 to really evaluate the condition of your facilities. And I think you all probably are aware there was pretty significant maintenance backlog identified in terms of investment. Now, as we sort of read through that report and it's clear to us that most of that is the kind of thing that needs to be addressed through capital investment, not necessarily through adding staff. But what you also want to do is to make sure that you have the personnel to be able to engage in preventive maintenance. The real value in making sure you have, especially mechanical, electrical, plumbing, electricians, is protecting that infrastructure, maximizing the useful life of that infrastructure, and minimizing the investment that's required when it's not replaced. We looked at your square footage. There's a number of great benchmarks with the International Facility Management Association that help frame this. Look at the type of your facilities, how you're utilizing them. And there's a need to add some facilities personnel to handle general maintenance. We've identified a need for 3 personnel. primarily focus on the electrician side of the house, and then, move into plumbing and then general maintenance essentially. Now, what I will say is there are some challenges, I think, from a compensation perspective. Again, this isn't a compensation study. There are some details that would have to be worked out with the union to really create an environment where you're attracting those personnel and being able to hire folks at a decent rate and fill those seats. Because there's some vacancies, especially among electricians, and they are prolonged vacancies that have had a fundamental impact. So remember when I mentioned the fleet folks, they're doing facility maintenance work because there's some vacancies there. So that's an area to pay attention to.
I would maybe just add because we don't talk a lot about our union or non-union groups and how that kind of factors in, but the way our public works and park maintenance and facilities are structured is the fleet maintenance, the mechanics, the snowplow drivers, the street workers, the utility workers, they're all local 49ers. So all of their job titles are public service workers. So when you hear Jonathan say they might be spending time on things they shouldn't be, he's talking about, we have pulled a mechanic to go plow snow because we want more snowplow drivers and they're in the same bargaining unit so they can be cross-trained and they can do each other's jobs. With electricians, that leads to somewhat of a different issue because they're not quite the same in terms of training and requirements, but they're still part of that same group under the same contract. So we have to work with the union on that.
Yeah, you want to be careful not to lose flexibility, right? You don't want to lose flexibility as a management group. You want to be able to manage the operation in the most flexible way that you can. But still.
Don't want
Yeah,
50 snowplow drivers that then are not doing anything in summer.
Exactly.
Which is why why that's set up in this place.
we also see some opportunities just from a broader facility maintenance coordination process. There's a need for a work order system on the facility maintenance side. But there are also a couple of departments who manage their own facility maintenance functions to some degree. Recreation, parks manages their own, golf to some degree. And just creating some consistent service level expectations, some consistent standards, and coordinating those functions a little better. Implementing a work order system is going to help do that. But there's some opportunities and space in that area as well, just to generate some common standards across each of those areas. So on the park side, obviously we looked at the park maintenance piece, and what I will say is, again, extremely high service levels. The mowing schedule is a target of at least weekly. Many of the ball fields, there's targets for 2 or 3 times a week, especially during the athletic season. There are some challenges I think to pay attention to. One is kind of the 2 big areas that stood out are on the turf maintenance as well as the park maintenance side. So on the turf side, you really only have 2 full-time employees plus seasonals, right? 2 full-time employees who are dedicated to that work. Your ice rink folks are all full-time and they work 7 days a week, 4 a.m. to noon, so it's a pretty grueling schedule during the ice rink season, right? So looking at some opportunity to add some full-time capacity that you can use year round. So when we think about full-time versus seasonal is great. You don't want to lose the flexibility of those seasonal positions, right? But what's that consistent band of work that you need year round? That's a justification for those warmer months and those winter months. That's really what you want to staff your full-time to and use your seasonal fulfillment. So adding some personnel in that space will really fundamentally improve those 2 areas. The other area that's related is, the National Recreation Park Association has really a great repository of best practices in terms of how other jurisdictions have utilized and created very specific service standards that will help define what your service needs are going forward. We've provided some detailed examples of that as an appendix to the report, and really be much more intentional about defining what service level intervals are. So weekly mowing, bi-weekly, what are your turf management practices, aeration, fertilization, how does that tie into stormwater management, right? And be much more intentional about defining what that looks like. We'll also position the city to more directly address any resource issues that may come up in the future. The other area on the park side that deserves some attention is on the forestry side. So you all adopted a much stronger tree ordinance, right? And that is going to have some fairly significant impact on the work of your forestry folks. There's also really an increase in the building plant workload. That's a tough one just because it can be cyclical. It's a pretty significant strain on your forestry personnel as well. So it's just an area that we've identified to pay some close attention to from a staffing perspective. So as you refine and sort of adopt what your service level expectations are, and make some schedule adjustments on the ice rink side, add some personnel there, to really give you just a few cues about what to pay attention to in the future and how to measure it, right? So those are the kind of the big bucket recommendations, those that have some significant staffing impact. So we're talking ultimately about 10 positions with a few areas to watch for the future, right? So about 4 folks in public works, 3 in engineering on the facility side, and 3 on the park maintenance side. Again, there are some, looking at stormwater, maybe some need for additional personnel as you start to implement that MS4 permit and best practice in that space. A few other opportunities there. And a few areas to pay attention to. But with that, I'll pause. I know we all have another closed session agenda item, so I just want to spend a few minutes. Do you have any questions or any discussion?
Questions for Jonathan?
Yeah,
That's a lot of information.
a lot in 30 minutes. Yeah.
So I think you covered this, but tell me again what triggered this study. Was it a concern from our management staff saying we seem to be staffed? And so what caused them to come out and talk to you?
Well, I would defer to the city on that, but.
So staffing levels is something that we've been looking at citywide. Well, we always look at it citywide. It's an ongoing evaluation. And I think periodically, usually in retreats, we have conversations about staffing level, increased service levels. What are the areas where council is looking to increase our service levels? What are the areas where maybe we can decrease service levels, or where we might want to bring to your attention where we could better manage our risk or might need more resources? So typically, what we have tended to do is focus on a few areas each year and try to really look at not just what do we need right now, but sort of what are the trends out there and have we been keeping up, or what are those blind spots? So a few years ago, we did the public safety study, and that was really focused on fire and police. And in the interim, we did facilities maintenance citywide that really looked at both in our public works areas and our park and rec areas. How can we better centralize facilities? And now this is just the year that we decided to look at public works and park maintenance, which normally we put those more together.
Thank you.
Population, service level changes, aging infrastructure. Really, we typically look at where those biggest needs. And, when we're looking at a staffing study, we're not typically looking at single incumbent types of services or positions or small areas like our strategy level areas. You're looking at what are those areas that have multiple employees that do a lot of work that's day-to-day work and has to be done year round.
Thank you.
That's way.
Your question? So, just I guess it is a question. If your recommendations are meant to represent a trend line, what is the recommended implementation for that timeline?
Yeah, so the next steps for us are to provide an implementation plan, which we have drafted. So the project report is delivered. We'll provide an implementation plan. Ultimately, it's up to the city. It's a resource consideration to determine what the layout is. But what I will say is on staffing studies, and especially with process improvement, we identified a couple of process improvement areas. You have to understand, we typically think in 5-year increments when we're thinking about a timeline, right? So one of the things we try to recognize is all the people who all these 23 recommendations represent new work to an organization that already is working time, right? So how do you build in these special projects? How do you build in these priority initiatives and phase them in a way that's manageable for the organization that you can effectively manage and implement going forward? So we typically start our implementation year plans in 5-year increments, but ultimately it's going to be up to your city manager and to your executive team to determine what's the best approach. What do we think makes sense in this? And what recommendations maybe don't we agree with? And here's why, and we're going to scrap this. That's perfectly appropriate too. We give our best snapshot. Things are going to change as the trajectory of the organization, your environment changes, right? So there's flexibility in there to do that. You know, ultimately, it's your city's leadership team is responsible for taking that.
Well, I take it that these recommendations, you said, Lisa, they're going to be reviewed by staff. All of the slides we saw were conclusory in nature. No underlying facts supporting any of the assertions that you made or conclusions that you reached in the recommendations. I take it that there is underlying data that support all this, and that's what you're talking about,
Yes.
digging into
Right,
to look at things.
right. And like any consultant study, it's very important to us. It's an objective outside look at our operations. It's much better for us to be able to have an outside look than to just simply say what we observe on our own. But of course, that is a starting point. So now we have to look as a team to really dive into it more, figure out what are those areas, what makes sense. And then ultimately, areas that have significant budget impacts, we're bringing back to you to have those discussions about what are the service levels that we want and need, and what are the ways that we could accomplish that, and what's most important to you. None of these, I don't think any of these positions are included in the current budget proposal. Is that correct?
Some of these recommendations based upon your expectation as to future need. Yes, so that's the sense I got of it. You'll set a 5-year time horizon.
So
Is that 5-year time horizon based on projected population increase, or is that
No.
factor at all?
so that's one of those things that's difficult to really effectively predict. What we have given you is our interpretation of where your service level is now, right? What your expectations are now, what your workload drivers are now, what the data tells us, and what the best practices tell us. This is what you need now. We have also identified here are areas where we think there's going to be growth or potentially expansion without necessarily defining what that number ought to be. So we want to kind of tee up the concept that this is an area that you all, as a governing body, will want to pay attention to, that your staff are going to pay attention to as you move forward, and may potentially draw additional resources without us being explicit about what that all looks like. Like the street sweeping. Bingo.
Questions, observations from council?
Well, I hope one of your snow plowing comparable cities was not Minneapolis. Okay,
Don't
thank
worry.
you.
Yeah, we check the news.
Okay.
No, we check with, try to determine the peers that you all would pay attention to.
Okay,
not-
thank you.
I think well, like a lot of areas in government, but I think especially public works is an area where people tend not to notice unless something is not working. So you notice if your water is not working, or if you have a sewer backup, or if you can't get through the street. So that's an area where it's important for us to proactively look at it.
Absolutely. On snapper, city government. That's right.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so
My
much.
pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, John. I guess. Thanks.
Fair, good news.
So if we could take a minute to clean the room of anybody who is not council or staff needed a closed session. We'll switch out equipment and then we'll get started in a second.